Josh, what do you think? The American people seem to like divided government.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. There's sort of a paradox with the election results because you had a clear majority of voters. Looks like Joe Biden is on track for about a 5-point lead or win when all the votes are counted. So, I mean, a clear majority of voters wanted to vote out President Trump. But I think it's also fair when, as Lisa said, when you look at the down ballot results, the Senate likely to stay in Republican hands, and the House Republicans making some surprising gains. They were uncomfortable with the broader Democratic agenda, or maybe perhaps more precisely, there wasn't really a Democratic agenda being articulated by Joe Biden. He was, predominantly running a campaign on a return to normalcy, on sort of taking Trump out of office, and the vacuum on policy was almost left for some of the more progressive voices within the Democratic Party. And I think when you look at the down ballot results, there were some moderate-minded suburban districts where Trump was not popular, but ultimately these voters cast their ballots for Republicans and for Joe Biden. But you've got this polarized electorate, about as little split ticket voting as we've ever seen in recent history. And the only times when you really saw that split ticket voting was when you had an incumbent who had a real defined record of bipartisanship. Susan Collins is probably the most prominent lawmaker who comes to mind that fits that profile. But there were some other House members who also were well-known veterans who had a good record of working across the aisle, and they were able to outrun the top of the ticket. Or you also saw some races where the challenger, usually Democratic challengers in this election, were seen as too progressive, too extreme, supported Medicare for all, endorsed Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren in the primary. Those candidates who were running in battleground districts and swing districts saw a pretty significant penalty from these swing voters, even as we've seen this increased tribalism, partisanship in our politics. So, I mean, I guess I'd close with just as looking at the top line analysis. We're in the middle, maybe at the end stage of something of a realignment, broadly speaking. When you look back over the last 4 years, Democrats have now consolidated the urban and the upscale suburban vote. Trump, it depends on what exit poll you look at, and the data is still a little bit noisy. But clearly, no matter what poll you look at, whether it was the Edison exit poll or the Fox exit poll, Trump had an all-time low performance among suburban voters. You have to go back to 1964 to see a worse Republican performance in the suburbs. So that's a reality. Republican voters did end up becoming Biden voters by significant numbers, or at least becoming Democrats over the last few years. But also working class whites are now becoming Republican. And these used to be swing voters. Obama in the Midwest performed very well with white voters in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But even though Biden may have made some small inroads in certain communities, the overall trend is unmistakable that the traditional heart of the LBJ FDR coalition, the working class white voters, are now becoming more or less party line Republicans. And that's something that's really on the minds of a lot of Democrats right now. And how do they win some of those voters back going forward? So that's the top line. There's a lot more to discuss, but it was a pretty momentous election.
Yeah, I want to get back to that progressive agenda you referenced a moment ago. So as Lisa said, if the Republicans hang on in Georgia, we're going to continue to have divided government, at least for the next 2 years. But we could say that both parties are at a crossroads right now. The Democrats will take over the White House, but what kind of Democratic Party will we see? For President-elect Biden, the job of placating his party's progressive wing will presumably be even more difficult for him if the Democrats do take back the Senate. So he might see that outcome as a mixed blessing, wouldn't he? What do you think about that, Josh?
Well, there are two ways you can look at it. Divided government can lead to gridlock, and you laid out one of them. I mean, I'll lay out the gridlock scenario, and I'll lay out the bipartisan scenario. I mean, the gridlock scenario is pretty clear that you have divided government, that a lot of Democrats don't view Mitch McConnell as a legitimate partner, as someone who actually wants to work and compromise. And furthermore, he doesn't have a lot of lawmakers in his caucus that are ultimately going to want to work with a Biden administration. And I think even more significantly that you have the House, which is the Pelosi's majority is going to be much narrower. She lost some of her moderate members, and she's going to be having a similar time to what John Boehner and Paul Ryan had to deal with a narrower majority where the most ideological members really can screw things up and make it harder to cut deals. And you also have a pretty a growing number of both parties' caucuses are dominated by the more ideological factions of their parties. So you can see the formula for gridlock. I wrote a column because I think people are underestimating the opportunities for bipartisanship given this alignment. Of course, we have to wait to see what happens in these two Georgia Senate runoffs. But assuming McConnell does have a very narrow majority going forward, he has a handful of lawmakers in that Senate caucus that don't want gridlock. Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Rob Portman, folks who have their own political incentives to compromise across the aisle. Biden's inheriting a scenario where there's actually going to be a lot of non-ideological agenda items, things that shouldn't, maybe they will be because everything's partisan these days, but certainly, getting COVID relief passed if this doesn't happen in the lame duck, dealing with healthcare, dealing with an economic stimulus. These are things that could be partisan footballs, but they're among the least ideological issues that you could possibly imagine for a president to deal with in his honeymoon period. So I don't think there's a lot of political incentives for Republicans to just be obstructionists because ultimately their voters also want help. They also want aid. They're struggling as well, and there is room, at least at the beginning, for some compromise. And I'd also add that even though you do have a larger percentage of ideologues within both caucuses, Republicans actually got an infusion of pragmatism of some more moderates in their caucus. When you look at the results, not a whole lot, but they're about they doubled the number of women in their caucus. But I think more importantly, they won some of the Biden and Clinton districts. They elected 2 Korean American lawmakers or executives from Orange County, California, which is a very purple area now, very competitive. They elected, a lot. If you look at some of the freshman class lawmakers, many of them are not from the kind of nihilistic wing, as I might call it, in the Republican Party, and their political incentives are to be a little more pragmatic. So while the Democrats lost a few of their moderates, Republicans gained a little bit more moderation, even though you hear a lot about some of the more extreme lawmakers. The ones who don't get as much attention but can also make a big difference in a narrowly divided House are some of the moderates, the folks who don't generally get as much publicity. So I mean, I do see an opportunity, and I think most importantly, frankly, Joe Biden is not Donald Trump. He's not Barack Obama. He is someone who is a creature of the Senate, is a creature of Washington, is someone who ran a campaign predominantly on trying to work across the aisle, insisting that there is a different way to go forward and do things in a more bipartisan way. And the president in our system does have a lot of power in setting the agenda for his party and really defining kind of the mood in Washington. So, I don't think he has any illusions that we're in a different time than when he was last in the Senate, but he is inheriting a political landscape that actually is quite favorable for bipartisanship.